On December 2nd, 1988, an 18-year-old man named Mike Warner came home from work at 3:30 in the afternoon. He walked into the apartment he shared with his fiancée and their 9-month-old daughter at the Riverside townhouses on East Hoffman Street in Three Rivers, Michigan. What he found when he opened the door was blood on the banisters, blood smeared across the walls, blood trailing up the staircase. He followed it upstairs and found the woman he loved lying on the bedroom floor, bloodied, mostly unclothed. She had been beaten, stabbed more than a dozen times, and strangled. Her name was Cathy Sue Swartz. She was 19 years old. In the next room, their baby daughter Courtney lay in her crib, unharmed, with a clean diaper. Someone had come into that apartment and destroyed a young mother while her infant slept on the other side of the wall. And for 35 years, no one could prove who did it. This is her story. Three Rivers, Michigan. The name comes from geography. The city sits at the confluence of the St. Joseph River and two of its tributaries, the Rocky River and the Portage River. Three rivers meeting in one place in the southwestern corner of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. In 1988, Three Rivers was a small city in St. Joseph County, population around 8,000. Kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where families went back generations, where kids grew up riding their bikes along the riverbanks and playing in the woods behind their houses. It was the kind of town where you left your doors unlocked because you knew your neighbors and your neighbors knew you. It was quiet. It was safe. Or at least, it felt that way. The Riverside apartments and townhouses sat along East Hoffman Street, a short walk from the river that gave the town its name. It was not a wealthy complex. It was the kind of housing young couples and single parents could afford. The kind of place where you could hear your neighbors through the walls. Where the parking lot filled up in the evenings when people came home from their shifts at the factories and restaurants and grocery stores that kept the town running. It was an ordinary place for ordinary people trying to build ordinary lives. And that is exactly what Cathy Swartz was doing. Cathy Sue Swartz was born on May 24, 1969 to David Michael Swartz Sr. and Audrey Sue Swartz. She grew up on a small farm in Mendon, Michigan, a tiny community about 10 miles north of Three Rivers. Farm life shaped her. She was active in 4-H and Girl Scouts. She was a talented artist who could draw and sketch with a skill that impressed everyone who saw her work. She loved to hunt with her father, tramping through the Michigan woods in autumn, learning patience and steadiness from a man she adored. Those who knew her described Cathy as sweet, caring, and warm. She had the kind of personality that drew people to her, a tomboy with a gentle heart, the kind of girl who would rather be out in the fields than sitting inside, but who would also sit with you for hours if you needed someone to talk to. Around 1987, the family moved to Three Rivers before Cathy's senior year. A new town, a new school, a new chapter. After high school, Cathy worked at a grocery store and at Burger King. She was 19 years old. She had a daughter named Courtney, who was the center of her world. And in September of 1988, she met Mike Warner. Mike was 18. He met Cathy that fall, and they fell hard for each other. Here was this young woman, barely out of her teens, raising a baby on her own, working whatever job she could find, and doing it with a warmth and determination that Mike found irresistible. They moved in together at the Riverside townhouses. On November 10th, 1988, just 2 months after they met, Mike proposed. Cathy said yes. They were engaged. They were building a life. They had a baby, an apartment, plans for the future. Everything was ahead of them. On the night of December 1st, 1988, Cathy and Mike had dinner together. Fish and chips. They spent the evening playing board games. A quiet Thursday night in a small Michigan town in early December. The Christmas season was just beginning. The next morning, Cathy planned to decorate a Christmas tree for baby Courtney. It would be the baby's first Christmas. Everything about that evening was normal. Everything about that evening was safe. The next morning, December 2nd, Mike Warner woke early and left for work at 5:25 in the morning. Cathy stayed home with the baby. It was a Friday. Mike would be gone all day. The apartment was quiet. The town was quiet. And somewhere in those hours between dawn and mid-afternoon, someone came to the door. There were no signs of forced entry. The locks were not broken. The door was not kicked in. Cathy either opened the door for someone she knew, or the door was already unlocked. The FBI would later profile the killer as someone who likely lived in the general area and may have known the victim. Someone Cathy had no reason to fear. Someone she let inside. What happened next was savage. The attack appears to have started in the kitchen. Blood drops on the kitchen floor. Then the violence moved. Blood smeared on the walls. Blood on the banisters. A trail of blood leading up the staircase to the bedroom where Cathy's body would be found. She fought back. She had defensive wounds on her hands where she had tried to grab the blade, tried to push it away. But the attacker was relentless. She was beaten. She was strangled. And she was stabbed more than a dozen times. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds. The crime scene told a story of calculated cruelty. In the bathroom, investigators found a size 9 bloody footprint. The killer had stopped to shower. He had washed Cathy's blood off his body before leaving. On the bed, a pink telephone lay with its cord cut. The killer had severed the phone line so Cathy could not call for help. On that phone, investigators found 2 fingerprints. One belonged to Cathy. The other belonged to someone they could not identify. And then there were the messages, written in blood. On Cathy's thighs, the words, "I was here," accompanied by an arrow. On the refrigerator and the wall, the words, "Metallica" and "Harley was here." It was a signature, a taunt. The killer had taken his time. He had stayed in that apartment long enough to shower, to write messages, to arrange his exit. And then he walked out the door, leaving a 9-month-old baby crying in her crib and a 19-year-old mother dead on the floor. The murder weapon was never found. When Mike Warner walked through the door at 3:30 that afternoon, his life ended in every way that mattered. The man he had been that morning, the boy who was planning a wedding and a future, ceased to exist the moment he saw the blood. He was 18 years old. He had been engaged for 22 days. Three Rivers Police Department responded. Michigan State Police crime scene technicians processed the apartment. They photographed everything. They collected blood samples, fingerprints, footprints. They documented the messages on the walls and on Cathy's body. They lifted the unknown fingerprint from the pink telephone on the bed. They measured the size 9 bloody footprint in the bathroom. They had physical evidence. What they did not have was a name. The investigation moved quickly at first. Thousands of people were interviewed. Fingerprints were collected from friends, acquaintances, and anyone who might have had contact with Cathy or the apartment. The FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime was consulted. They developed a profile of the perpetrator. The killer likely lived in the area. He probably knew the victim. He had spent considerable time at the crime scene, suggesting familiarity and a lack of fear of being discovered. The brutality of the attack, combined with the evidence of attempted sexual assault and the taunting messages, pointed to someone driven by rage and a desire for control. Within days, investigators had their first suspect, Troy Daniel Schultes. He was Cathy's ex-boyfriend. He was a fan of the band Metallica. His nickname was Harley, and his truck had been spotted outside Cathy's apartment on the afternoon she was killed. The messages on the refrigerator and wall seemed to point directly at him. Metallica. Harley was here. Schultes was arrested 3 days after the murder and charged with Cathy's killing. During questioning, he admitted to writing the messages on the refrigerator and the wall. He said he had been at the apartment. But he denied writing the message on Cathy's body, and when investigators compared his fingerprints and footprints to the evidence found at the scene, they did not match. The unknown fingerprint on the pink telephone was not his. The size 9 bloody footprint in the bathroom was not his. The charges against Troy Schultes were dropped, and with that, the case began its long descent into darkness. The investigation continued, but the leads dried up. Officers had collected fingerprints from hundreds of individuals. None matched the print on the telephone. No one matched the footprint. The murder weapon was never recovered. The DNA evidence recovered from the scene sat in storage, waiting for technology that did not yet exist. Months became years. Years became decades. The case file grew thicker with dead ends and unanswered questions, until eventually it was placed in a box, and the box was placed on a shelf. Cathy's mother, Audrey, lived with the weight of her daughter's unsolved murder for the rest of her life. Mike Warner carried the image of what he found that afternoon for the rest of his. And baby Courtney grew up without her mother, knowing only that someone had taken her away before she was old enough to form a single memory of her. There is something you need to understand about what the investigation missed. Mike Warner had a childhood friend, a boy he had known since middle school. They had spent nights at each other's houses. They had built forts together in the woods. The kind of friendship that roots itself in the soil of a small-town childhood and feels like it will last forever. That friend's name was Robert Waters. In late 1988, not long after Mike and Cathy got together, Robert Waters came back through Three Rivers. He was visiting the area. Mike ran into him and invited him over. Waters and his girlfriend came to the apartment on East Hoffman Street. They spent a few hours there. They met Cathy, they met the baby, and then they left. It was approximately 1 month before the murder. Mike Warner told the police about this visit. He told them that Robert Waters had been in the apartment, but Waters had moved away. He had gone to Phoenix, Arizona. He was out of the picture. And in 1988, with no computerized fingerprint databases, no DNA analysis capabilities, and a suspect already in custody who seemed to fit the profile, no one ever checked Robert Waters' prints against the evidence at the crime scene. It was a missed opportunity that would cost 35 years. By the 2000s, DNA technology had advanced enough that the biological evidence from 1988 could be processed. In 2012, the unknown male DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database of criminal offenders' genetic profiles. The search returned no match. Whoever killed Cathy Swartz had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. He was not in the system, and so the case waited. The DNA sat in a database. The fingerprint sat in a file. And somewhere in the world, the man who had murdered Cathy Swartz was living his life. In May of 2022, something changed. Scott Bowling had recently become the chief of the Three Rivers Police Department. That same month, Joel Schultze, the DNA director at the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory in Grand Rapids, contacted the St. Joseph County Prosecutor's Office. The state lab had a cold case grant. They were offering to run cases through a new technology called forensic genetic genealogy. The Cathy Swartz case was selected. The evidence was submitted to Othram Inc, a laboratory in Houston, Texas, that specializes in extracting usable DNA from degraded, decades-old evidence. Othram scientists used a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive genetic profile from the 34-year-old evidence. Then their in-house genealogy team used that profile to search public genealogy databases, the kind ordinary citizens use to trace their family trees. The system worked. Partial matches with distant relatives of the unknown suspect were identified. Genealogists built family trees from those matches, working backward through generations, narrowing the field of possible suspects. By January of 2023, they had narrowed it to one family with 4 sons, the Waters brothers. Investigators began the process of elimination. Barry Waters was already in CODIS for a prior offense. His DNA did not match. Son Waters voluntarily provided a DNA sample. Not a match. John Waters did the same. Not a match. That left one brother, Robert Odell Waters, age 53, living in Beaufort, South Carolina. Detectives traveled to Beaufort. They found Robert Waters living a life that bore no resemblance to the violence of December 2nd, 1988. He was married. He had 2 children. He and his wife owned a successful plumbing business. He had no criminal record. He was a husband, a father, a business owner, a man who, by all outward appearances, had built a respectable life in a quiet southern town 1,500 miles from Three Rivers, Michigan. When detectives contacted him, Waters was initially reluctant to meet. He agreed to come in only when he was told they had a warrant for his DNA, his fingerprints, and his footprints. He came. He provided the samples. The results were definitive. Robert Waters' DNA matched the DNA recovered from Cathy Swartz's crime scene. His fingerprints matched the unknown print lifted from the pink telephone on the bed, the print that had sat unidentified in a file for 35 years. The man who had cut Cathy's phone cord, the man who had beaten her, strangled her, stabbed her more than a dozen times, the man who had showered in her bathroom, written on her body, and walked out the door while her baby cried. It was Robert Waters. His childhood friend's fiancé, a woman he had met in that very apartment just weeks before he came back to kill her. On April 30th, 2023, Robert Odell Waters was arrested in Beaufort, South Carolina, and charged with the open murder of Cathy Sue Swartz. The arrest came 35 years, 4 months and 28 days after Cathy's body was found on her bedroom floor. He waived his right to fight extradition. He would be sent back to Michigan to face trial. But the trial would never come. On the morning of May 6, 2023, 6 days after his arrest, guards at the Beaufort County Detention Center found Robert Waters dead in his cell. He had hanged himself with a bedsheet from the top bunk. He was 53 years old. In his cell, guards found pamphlets about forgiveness printed with Bible verses. Whether he was seeking forgiveness for what he had done to Cathy Swartz, or forgiveness for what he was about to do to himself, no one will ever know. Robert Waters took his secrets to the grave. There will be no trial. There will be no testimony. There will be no moment where Cathy's daughter stands before a jury and tells them what it was like to grow up without her mother. The justice system was denied its process. The family was denied their day in court. But the science spoke. The DNA spoke. The fingerprint on the pink telephone preserved for 35 years spoke. And what it said was this: Robert Odell Waters, childhood friend of Mike Warner, walked into that apartment on East Hoffman Street on December 2nd, 1988, and murdered Cathy Sue Swartz. He was not a stranger. He was not a drifter. He was someone who had sat on their couch and held their baby and shared their evening just weeks earlier. And then he came back, and he destroyed her. The Western Michigan University Cold Case program played a critical role in the resolution of the case. Students in the program spent hundreds of hours scanning and organizing approximately 10,000 documents from the original investigation. They created a searchable database that allowed detectives to quickly sift through decades of information while working in the field. They built timelines and suspect indexes. It was meticulous, unglamorous work. The kind of work that does not make headlines but makes breakthroughs possible. The Cathy Swartz case was the second cold case the WMU students helped solve. The first was the 1987 murder of Roxanne Wood. Cathy's daughter Courtney grew up. She survived. She lived her entire life knowing that someone had murdered her mother when she was 9 months old and that no one had been held accountable. When the case was finally resolved, she said the words that 35 years of silence had been building toward. I've been living with this for 36 years. They solved this case with DNA, so I can close this book. Mike Warner, the 18-year-old boy who found his fiancé dead on the floor of their apartment, later said something that cut through every layer of bureaucracy and procedure and institutional failure. The killer was known to police. He had told them about Robert Waters. He had told them that Waters had been in the apartment, and no one had ever checked. Three Rivers is still a small town in southwestern Michigan. The rivers still meet where they have always met. The riverside townhouses still stand on East Hoffman Street. And on December 2nd of every year, the anniversary passes quietly, as it has for more than 3 decades. Most people in town have moved on or moved away. But for the people who loved Cathy Swartz, for her daughter who never knew her, for the man who found her body and had to live with that image for the rest of his life, December 2nd, 1988 never ended. It just waited. 35 years for a fingerprint to find its match. 35 years for the science to catch up to the crime. 35 years for the name to finally be spoken aloud. Robert Odell Waters. He lived a mile away. He had been in the apartment. He had been reported to the police, and no one checked. The DNA checked.